Welcome to the Read, Talk, Grow podcast, where we explore health topics through books. We're going to focus today on one of our integrative medicine topics, specifically discussing poetry and its health effects. Our book is A Bit Much by Lyndsay Rush. I'm your host, Dr. Denise Milstein. I'm an assistant professor of medicine at Mayo Clinic, where I practice women's health internal medicine and integrative medicine. I'm so excited about my two guests. Lyndsay Rush is a comedy writer, the co-founder of the branding agency Obedient, and the poet behind the popular Instagram account at Mary Oliver's Drunk Cousin. Her writing has been featured in Reductress, McSweeney's, New York Magazine, and the New York Times. She spent most of her adult life freezing in Chicago, but currently swelters in Nashville with her husband and young son. A Bit Much is her debut collection and first book. Lyndsay, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Denise.
Dr. Shelley Noland is a hand and peripheral nerve surgeon at Mayo Clinic, where she is an associate professor of surgery. And she is the medical director for the Center for Humanities and Medicine at Mayo Clinic. Shelley, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Very excited to be here.
A Bit Much is a collection of short poems that, as the book's cover promises, are for people who didn't even know they liked poetry. Lyndsay uses humor to address the female experience, from friendship to aging to pregnancy to kindness and love. On Read Talk Grow, we discuss books to better understand health. And in this case, we're not discussing a specific health topic, but rather a healing approach. In fact, writing, reading, sharing, and discussing poetry has been shown to have many health effects. So let's jump in. Lyndsay, you did not set out to be a poet, yet here you are with a book of poems. How did that happen?
Yeah. I often call myself an accidental poet because, I've been a writer for my whole career, but had never dabbled in the form until the tail end of COVID, actually. And I think I just, like a lot of people, had a lot of emotions, a lot of thoughts, and not a lot of places to put them. So I just started putting them on paper and really fell in love with the way that poetry lets you sort of put things out there with a question mark. I like that it doesn't have to be definitive. I could explore heavier topics and just say, what if this were true? Or this has been my experience, dot, dot, dot. And then which is my sort of signature way of writing, wove jokes into it, and which felt fresh and fun. And I found an audience for that very quickly. So, yeah, that's sort of the very short version of how I'm here today.
We love it. Shelley, I know you have some opinions about having all these thoughts and emotions and needing a place to put them and turning to poetry for that. Maybe you can comment on that and then also tell our listeners about your role in medical humanities and why that's so important.
Sure, yes, of course. First, I'll tackle the medical humanities. And I think, the goal of the humanities and medicine at Mayo Clinic is really to integrate the arts into the healing environment. And that's for everyone, from patients to providers to patient families. We want the humanities to really touch everyone who walks through the door. And we want to stand out in that regard for the consideration of all of those multidisciplinary aspects that contribute to the humanities and the patient's experience overall. For me personally, I do have a love of poetry and medicine, and I have a similar COVID story. I think COVID gave us a chance to stop and take a breath. And in the medical field, I think some of us felt like we hadn't stopped and taken a breath for 10, 15 years even. And so I found a smidge of time during COVID and found myself drawn to poetry and was able to take a few classes. And I think what I love about poetry and medicine is, like you said, I think of poetry as a way of saying something that can't be said any other way. And sharing something that you have a difficult time articulating or putting in words. So it gives you an outlet for those difficult things. And for me, I found myself doing a lot of writing about my training experience and some of the prior experiences I had. And I was writing about medicine and work primarily. And so that's what I love about it. The other thing I love about poetry is that it's brief and it doesn't take a long time. And so if you're a busy professional, a patient, provider, all you need is 20 minutes and you can write a poem, you can read a poem, you can do a quick session of blackout poetry. And so it's extremely accessible and that can be in person, that can be virtual. So the sky's the limit for what poetry can do. And I think it's actually feasible in our busy lives.
Can you explain that last term you used, the blackout poetry?
Yes, absolutely. One of my favorite ways to introduce poetry to people who are new to it, and Lyndsay, I'm sure you know many people who are afraid of poetry. They hear poetry and they want to run in the opposite direction because they feel like if they're not Walt Whitman, then why bother? And so blackout poetry is wonderful because what it is you give someone a large piece of text, and it can literally be anything from a medical textbook to a newspaper article, anything. And you have them scratch out words, and then the remaining words become their unique poem, and that is their unique poem, and they have ownership over that. So it's a very simple way to introduce poetry to groups, and it's wonderful to do virtually as well. And we've done it with a lot of our medical students here. Open people up to seeing that poetry doesn't have to be daunting, it doesn't have to be scary. You don't have to be a brilliant English professor to do it. Anyone can do it. And sometimes people are really surprised at what they're able to create.
And Lyndsay, you have some examples of this in the book. So can you comment about it as well?
Yeah, I do. I think that is, I have a lot of teachers actually that follow my work and have used it to teach their students that poetry is for everybody, because I really do believe that. And I think something that excites me so much in the last, as long as I've been a part of the poetry community, is how accessible it has become and continues to become. Like you were saying, Shelley, that this is something not only that people should not be scared to digest and read. There's so much poetry for so many different types of tastes and people, but it's also something that I think a lot of people would find a lot of joy and excitement to write. So for a couple poems in my book, I wanted to write sort of companion pieces. So I would black out my own work, create blackout poems, or I've also heard them called erasure poems, and to sort of synthesize a longer poem into a bite-sized moment. And I think I do that maybe 5 or 6 times. And so that was a really fun thing for me to do. And then those are the only poems in the book that are on, what would you call them? Pages that face each other.
Both sides.
Yes,
Yes.
both sides. Everything else was just on one. So then we would have them be little pairings.
Erasure or blackout poetry. So this could be a gateway to looking at poetry and incorporating it in your life. Okay, Lyndsay, let's talk about the title. So I work in women's health, right? Many women have been told for a long time that they are a bit much. They've been told tone it down. They've been given messages that they should be smaller, not take up so much space. And so you flip that on its head in the poem She's a Bit Much, in which you take this typically negative phrase and make it much more positive. Like sometimes a bit much is the sprinkles or it's the unexpected upgrade to business class. Can you talk to our listeners about this poem?
Yeah. So this poem, She's a Bit Much, is obviously the hero title, the titular title of which the book is named after. So I was sharing these poems on Instagram. I'd created this account with the handle you read earlier. It always makes me laugh in interviews. You guys are remarkably talented in this very prestigious field, and you're saying Mary Oliver's drunk cousin. I made that user handle, pardon me, I made that username as a nod to the famous poet Mary Oliver, as a way to let my new audience know that I hoped to encompass her curiosity and willingness to be astonished. I love that about her as a poet. But she talks a lot about nature and beautiful scenescapes and animals and things. And I was writing more about nail art or potato chips or pop culture. And so in a way I was like, oh, I'm like her drunk cousin. I hope to embody a lot of the things that people love about her, but a little more spicy, a little more blasphemous. Anyway, so I started posting these poems on Instagram, and She's a Bit Much was the first one to sort of have a viral moment. And I realized how many women resonated with the idea of feeling like they were too much, and that was so weaponized against women specifically as a way, like you said, to diminish them, to keep them small, to keep them quiet. So, there's this sort of popular meme that is going around that says, if I'm too much, go find less. But what I sort of did with this poem is that I think when people tell you you're a bit much, instead of saying go find less, you say thank you. A bit much can be and is a beautiful thing if you're able to embrace that. Like, I just think it's a beautiful thing, and it has turned out to empower a lot of people and a lot of my audience to embrace that part of them and to celebrate it.
So, Shelley, many women will have experienced distress and trauma about trying to fit into a cultural norm or apologizing for their bodies and the space they take up. How can poetry possibly help with mood, stress, and even trauma?
I think poetry can be helpful in many endeavors. I think that it's been shown that the act of writing the poetry is therapeutic for writers. And as we said earlier, anyone can be that writer, and whether that's a patient in our perspective or a physician. But then there's also the act of reading the poetry, which can also be therapeutic. And, there are physicians who imagine having waiting rooms with poetry books in the waiting room that apply to that particular problem. Say it's a breast cancer clinic, there would be a book of poems there that is written by breast cancer survivors or potentially written by physicians who take care of breast cancer patients. And so bringing that into this specific realms of whatever the condition would be if we're talking in the medical space.
I love that. It's so important to think about the writing, the reading, and then also the sharing, the reading out loud and the sharing. Lindsay, when I bought your book when it first came out, I was at my cabin and I literally sat on my porch with a friend and her husband, and we each picked a poem to read out loud and just like jaw dropping and could discuss it because it really does, they all apply to real life. Okay, so, Lindsay, much of your writing starts with your short posts, especially on social media, which is a great social experiment of sorts to know what's resonating with readers right away. Can you tell our listeners about the process and then how they eventually became the poems in your book?
Yeah, I really did use Instagram as a playground, a writing playground and an experimental space to see if what I was feeling and the way I was writing it made sense to anybody else, and to really start to find my people. And that was such a fun experience. And like I said before, once She's a Bit Much, the poem had some virility and was shared by celebrities, which just blew my mind at the time. I was like, oh my goodness, which is why I dedicate the book to Michelle Pfeiffer as a sort of joke, but she was the first celebrity to share that any of my work, and she put it on her actual feed. And so the dedication says, for Michelle Pfeiffer, you know why. I just thought it would be a funny nod. And with that turning point, I realized, I think the topic in general of really embracing who you are and pushing against social norms that want to minimize the female experience and or the expression of that female experience, that became a centerpiece and sort of a through line. So that really helped not necessarily form the exact pieces that went into the book, but the holistic aim of the book. I was like, this, it has to be a bit much, because that just is what keeps resonating over and over again in different ways. So as I continued to explore that, I could really tell which poems were, I guess, hitting. But then when I signed the book deal, I could no longer put new work on Instagram that was going in the book. So at that point, I just had to trust what I knew to be true about what I wanted to say and maybe what I hoped would resonate with people. And yeah, that's sort of how it came to be.
I bet there were a lot of surprises about what did resonate. And since you talked about body image a little bit, there are a couple that I picked out for our listeners to go and listen to that really focus on body image. So maybe we'll start with Love Yourself, Girl. And the first line of this is body positivity is fantastic for everyone else. And it goes on. So I think it's great to be in your head with all these real thoughts, being honest about how we'd like to feel good about our bodies, but we've culturally been really taught to criticize. Shelley, what do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, my training is in plastic surgery as my background prior to hand surgery. And, a big part of that is appearance, obviously. And a big subsection of plastic surgery is aesthetic surgery. And something we deal with a lot is where's the balance? Where is the balance where it's okay to pursue things to improve your body image and your confidence versus where it becomes, almost pathologic and negative. And I think there's not a woman on this planet that doesn't suffer from some form of concerns about their body image. I mean, that is everybody, all of us can identify with that. And having faced those norms and those cultural expectations certainly affects every woman, all of us.
In episode 42, we talked with Dr. Elizabeth Coman about her book, All in Her Head. And part of that was about plastic surgery through history of women's health and who are these women making those changes for and to what standard, right? Because there's nothing wrong with plastic surgery inherently, but ideally it's because it makes you feel better about your body or more comfortable in your body, not because of a cultural standard or because traditionally many plastic surgeons are male, a man's concept of what's a beautiful female form. So thanks for tying that in, Shelley.
Yeah, I find the topic of beauty and aging, I explore that a bit in the book. And the aim would be, if there's a book number two, which we're thinking about, that it would be sort of about big life transitions and growing older and all of the things that come along with that. Because I feel the same way. I'm 41, which is by no means old, but it's just wild. I put up a joke the other day that it was like big aging wants you to think that 40 is old. Don't fall for it. Even someone saying she looks great for her age or you don't look your age. I just really want to continue to write work that pushes against the idea that it is a bad thing to look or act like a product of our time. Like I was born in 1983. There are going to be things that will seem, quote, cringy to a younger generation. And so I talk about accepting your cringe and accepting being weird. And I think the same goes for the external and the internal, to really just question for ourselves, why do I think that I should look or be something else? Unless it's for my own, like you said, my own desires and my own mental health.
Yeah, I completely agree. Hey, listeners, we hope you're enjoying this episode of Read, Talk, Grow. If you find our discussions helpful and insightful, please take a moment to subscribe to and rate Read, Talk, Grow on your preferred podcast platform. And don't forget to tell your friends to listen. Your support will help us reach more readers and those eager to learn about health through books. As always, feel free to drop us a line at readtalkgrow@mayo.edu with suggestions for books, topics, or any comments. Thanks for listening. This is a nice segue to another poem called A Race Against the Guac. And the line I like from this is, society tells women that we are avocados, ripe for just the teensiest amount of time. This idea of aging and sort of that perfection at that moment, which I'm not sure how many women are like, this is it. My body and life is perfect at this moment, right? Typically we look back and we're like, oh, back then, but we didn't necessarily feel it in the time. And future selves are not going to look at this time and think, wow, you were so healthy at 41. But I think that's the point you're making, that we're all aging, and it's not that we're only ripe and delicious and beautiful for that blink. Why do avocados do that? I can never quite catch that moment as
I
well.
know. I know. It is just a crazy thing to sort of realize that, like you said, if we're not careful, we can be chasing something elusive and ever changing that we will never catch. There's an author I love, her name is Anne Lamott, and she has essays about this. And so I'm going to paraphrase it, but it says, what, am I just not going to swim in the ocean because of my stomach? Or am I going to miss, am I going to spend my whole life, as Mary Oliver would say, my one wild and precious life being concerned about my soft upper arms? Not to get too deep, but it is also can be, it's what's the phrase I'm looking for? A tactic, I believe, to keep women focused on our appearance versus all of these other things that matter. We have so many hours in a day, and if that many of them are concerned about improving, I have poems about this as well. The whole idea of self improvement can be so wonderful on one hand. And then on the other hand, sometimes I'm like, can I just rest? Like now I'm supposed to have like hundreds of grams of protein. I don't have the time to do all of the things that we're being told all the time to get better on an aesthetic front. And it's just something I think about a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And then, Shelley, maybe you'll comment on this one, another poem called Goops, I Did It Again, talking about skincare essentially and all the steps. And one of the middle steps is a guttural feral scream. And you end by saying, before you let the sunshine in, you have to let the rage out. So that idea of inside outside beauty being connected.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely resonate, and I think we all do, with self-care now feels like another task on my to-do list. And, just discussing with my best friend this morning, like the to-do list just gets longer, and now it's another obligation is I have to rest and relax, but that feels like a work object that needs to happen. It's overwhelming for women. I mean, the expectations are so high and they're just so unrealistic. But I do think we've made progress. I think, audiences like yours that have come to the forefront may not have been celebrated as much 10 or 15, 20 years ago. I was born in 1980 and Gen X. And, you look back on some of the pop culture of the 90s and the early 2000s, and there was extreme public body shaming of celebrities and women, and it was accepted. And we didn't even think anything of it back then. We didn't even realize how bad it was at that time. So we are going in the right direction in terms of women and all of that. But yes, now the onus is okay, now you have to be resilient and you have to have empathy and you have to have perfect skincare. And yes, it's a 10-step skincare routine. And don't you dare go out in the sun. The list goes on and on and on and on. And for women who, most of us have many things going on in our lives, work, family, friends, everything, it feels daunting and impossible many days to juggle it all.
And the expectation that we have to make all of that look easy or
Mhm.
effortless because we have been told there is value in effortlessness. She's just the no makeup look. And how does she do it all? And I think a lot of us are screaming, we do not, we can't do it all. And because like you said, Shelley, the list does keep growing. But I also agree that we are going in the right direction.
Maybe through having platforms, social media, and now hopefully our audience will think poetry as well. Another health experience that you spend some time with in the book is pregnancy, and that's really beautifully depicted. Of course, with your sense of humor. There's one lovely poem called Mum's the Word, where you reflect on the early pregnancy and then this constant stream of words, of advice, of delight, of warning, and go on to mention several people like your dental hygienist telling you and asking you questions that have nothing to do with your teeth or what they should know about the private parts of your life. Talk about writing about pregnancy.
Yeah, so I was writing the manuscript all the way up, and I turned in the final manuscript the day before I went into the hospital and had my son. So I, joke that I had a book and a baby in the same year. What, like it's hard? What can't she do? And so I obviously found myself with a lot of emotions. This is my first child. I was, according to medicine, they don't use this. My doctor said, she's like, I do not use this term, but a geriatric pregnancy or AMA, advanced maternal age. And I just had, of course, again, a lot of thoughts and emotions. And I really enjoyed writing about that. And I ended up saving a lot of those poems as well as this first year of motherhood for book number 2. And one of the things that struck me, I think, was other people's expectations and opinions, and realizing very early on that just like a lot of aspects of women's lives, that I'm going to have to filter out what I take in, because I'll either and really try to learn how to listen to my own intuition and my own voice. And then secondly, how vastly different, certainly in pregnancy, but even beyond, my experience was with my husband's experience with in parenting, and those expectations of body and capacity and talent and everything I should and shouldn't be doing. Poetry helped me so much process through all of that, and continues to do so, because my life has never changed in that way that vastly before.
The end of that poem is referring to your husband, the dad to be, the invisible dad to be, blissfully sipping on a half full beer while not a single soul asks him what crib he's registered for. It's it's brilliant because it's absolutely true, where the woman is getting all, or the pregnant person is getting all of the questions down to the nitty-gritty.
I think that it's important to also reflect that, I think your audience came about around this COVID era as well. And I think it's important to recognize that COVID affected men and women so differently, especially mothers, because along the lines of what you're saying, a lot of the extra duties of childcare, that schools being closed, those all fell onto mothers. And it's not the same. And I think there are a lot of mothers in the COVID era and post-COVID who have never recovered or never gone back to work if they were working. And so I think that that really ties into your audience. Why there's such an appetite for this is because partly COVID and what women experienced.
Yeah. As my son is 1.5 now, and I was thinking the other day, we're very fortunate to have childcare, but what that would have been like, I was like, oh my goodness, if I just had to somehow do my job with this child at home. I do not know how parents of children, especially young children, moms during COVID, survive, how they did it. It had to have been so hard.
And that's one of the things I love about poetry, is that in these brief pieces, we often reflect on other things that resonate with us or are reminded of memories. There's a poem called You've Got Mail, where you're watching a man build a mailbox for a woman because she's introduced herself as an old woman who's dying. And we did a podcast on the book We All Want Impossible Things by Catherine Newman. And
I love that book.
this is such a beautiful, beautiful book, right? But about the experience of being alongside somebody who's dying. And we talked with her about showing up and not just saying, let me know if there's anything I can do, which is useless, but like showing up and building the mailbox. You say, I think of all the forms I've seen love take: open arms, open doors, gourmet sandwiches, and I add a new one to the list: mailboxes, inspired by this man. So this is what I love. This is a question for you, Shelley, is that you can read a poem and it's about something, but don't you find that this medium particularly then often invites you to jump to a related experience or a shared experience of your own?
Absolutely. I think one of the greatest strengths of poetry is getting comfortable with the ambiguity and the different interpretations. And that's what I love about poetry and medicine is in medicine we have to live in unknowns. We have to live in a lot of ambiguity. A lot of times we don't know what the answer is or we never actually find the answer. And so poetry teaches us to be more comfortable with that ambiguity, to have our own interpretations, and also teaches us that multiple interpretations can all be correct. And that's why partly why it's so great for medical education is we're teaching medical students that this is the environment that you need to be comfortable with. And we also include something we've been looking into called visual thinking strategies, which is similar, looking at a piece of art, for example, and how do we all interpret that? What do we each see in that piece of art? Poetry is very similar. We're all going to read it differently. We're going to find different things in it that are important to us or that stand out that we can relate to. And it can only help us be better people, but also better physicians and providers.
I love that. That is so fascinating. I've never thought about the medical field in that way with that shared ambiguity. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
And how poetry can be that bridge.
Absolutely.
So, Lyndsay, you knew you were going to talk to us. You knew we were going to talk about health and poetry. Is there a specific poem that you would want to highlight from the collection that applies to this conversation?
I think on the topic of grief, especially, I have found that poetry really was a helpful medium for me reading it and writing it. We had to put our beloved dog to rest the week we got home from the hospital with our baby that same week. And it was just, I had such conflicting emotions of joy and sorrow. There's a poem that actually it's towards the back and it's called I'll Hold It For You. It's really about trying to hold each other's hands, so to speak, emotionally when you're going through something hard. And I wrote it when I was going through all of that because it just reminded me that people coming alongside you, sort of like we all want impossible things. It is so hard to come alongside someone and find the words. And that's another thing I love about poetry is sometimes if someone is going through something and I don't know what to say, to send them a beautiful poem and say, this helped me, or this helped me name the feeling, or put those things I know that are in my head into words in a way that I couldn't have done myself. I love what poetry does for us in that sense. So it's called I'll Hold It For You. And then when we were talking about companion pieces with my erasure blackout poems, the one that is the companion piece to this is called I Will Remind You of Your Joy. And it was sort of when I turned the page on grief and started to remember good things or, sort of get back to my life. And at first, joy felt like a betrayal to the grief or to the thing or person you had lost. And then I had a lot of people come into my life and remind me of the beautiful things. Those two poems are almost the last two, I think. Well, the last like five. And I love them as a set. And I don't know if that exactly answers your question about health. I imagine there's a lot of research on grief and trauma and how that shows up physically, but that processing in that way through poetry was very healing for me.
Thank you for that. It's true. The grief can be really difficult. And I love what you said about sharing poems when you don't want to say nothing and you don't want to say something that's trite or meaningless. I actually sent reassurances to save for a stormy day to a friend this morning after I reread the book last night because of what she's going through. It reminded me of her, and she said, I'm going to print it and hang it up on my wall. So you change lives, you affect lives. Shelley, I want to just talk briefly about the types of poetry that are available. And so we've talked a little bit that Lyndsay's poems are very modern. They refer to modern references. They have a level of humorous. I don't know, Lyndsay, I hope it's not offensive to call them sort of casual. They're meant to be very accessible, very easy to digest, understand. They should feel like they apply to kind of this day, but there's a whole spectrum of poems out there. And I wonder if you would just comment about kind of that range and where you also seek different types of poetry.
Absolutely. I mean, I think getting back to what Lindsay said also about grief, I think the types of poems, I think in your book you had them organized by subject almost, or need, what the need of the reader is at that moment. And that's one thing I love about poetry is that some of the types are what need you have at that time, including grief or happiness or sadness. And I like poems that are organized that way because they are easy to share out. And there are facilities that use poems as actual prescriptions where poems are prescribed to patients that are going through a specific topic. And I think that's something that we need to explore more and grow in that space. But the idea of using poetry to help treat, alongside traditional medicine, how to help treat certain things. So I appreciate that what you said about grief and the different types of poems. In terms of different types of poems, the sky's the limit. Poetry is anything and everywhere. And I had a poetry mentor who said, you can write anything down and you can call it a poem, and there really are no rules, which is great. And that's what makes it more accessible to more and more people. But certainly, poetry in medicine has a very long history. Many of the earliest physicians were actually poets, strangely enough. And there's historical ties that weave through over the years and years and years. And so I enjoy going back and reading a lot of the historical physician poets and finding that, what they were writing and talking about back in the historic times actually still apply today. Certainly, like probably the most famous physician poet of all time is William Carlos Williams, and he famously wrote his poets on prescription pads and was a very busy practicing physician. And at that time, it was pretty rare to be a busy physician and be a successful poet. So I still enjoy reading a lot of his work. But, Walt Whitman had a lot of medical ties, John Keats, they're everywhere. And then you have the poets who had their own mental illness or other things they were facing, like Sylvia Plath. And so there's just so much to weave through it. And I was fortunate enough to take a class in poetry and medicine, which is offered here at Arizona State University. And learning about how they're connected is what really got me passionate about it. There's so many connections.
It's so fascinating.
I believe it's in London, Shelley, I don't know if you've seen it, it was going around the internet for a while, a store that is set up like a drugstore that prescribes poetry. I don't remember the name offhand, but sort of similar, that you go in and you have a need or a emotion you're feeling, and they prescribe you a poem.
Yes, here at Mayo Clinic, we actually have a garden and we have a little box where there'll be poems in the box and you can select a poem. And we also envision having like bubblegum dispenser machines, but they would dispense poems instead, that employees could walk up and request a poem and would be dispensed to them. So that's sort of some of the things that we're working on to bring it into the space.
That's so cool.
Really, really cool projects. Okay, Lyndsay, I think it's probably true that you've inspired your readers to read more poetry. And we've talked about a few sources where they can find more, but we're hoping our listeners will get a copy of A Bit Much and look at the role that poetry just might play in their lives and in their health. Thank you both for being here with me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Read, Talk, Grow is a product of the Women's Health Center at Mayo Clinic. This episode was made possible by the generous support of Ken Stevens. Our producer is Lisa Speckhard-Pask, and our recording engineer is Rick Andreessen. Visit our show notes to see the books discussed today and for links to other health education materials. Follow us on social media like Instagram and Facebook, or reach out directly to our email, readtalkgrow@mayo.edu, with suggestions for books or topic ideas. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not designed to replace a physician's medical assessment and judgment. Information presented should not be relied on as medical advice Please contact a healthcare professional for medical assistance if needed for questions pertaining to your own health. Keep reading, everyone.